Hi class! So today we're going to continue learning about cell structures. Let's get started. So last time I told you that all cells can be divided into two main categories, prokaryotic versus eukaryotic. And today we're going to focus about learning about the various specialized structures inside eukaryotic cells. So let's review the defining features of eukaryotic cells. So all eukaryotic cells have membrane-bound organelles, these various structures that each carry out specialized functions. The other defining feature is that eukaryotic DNA is enclosed within a nucleus, which is one of these organelles. So here in a plant cell, this is the organelle called the nucleus, and here it is in an animal cell. Now, all of these internal membranes that surround the organelles are made up of phospholipids and proteins. Just like the plasma membrane that you already learned about, there's a bilayer of phospholipids with proteins embedded between them. Now, these different organelle membranes, they each have unique phospholipids and proteins, and these allow the organelles to carry out their specialized functions. So we're now going to go through the organelles one by one to learn about their functions. So let's first start with the nucleus. So the job of the nucleus is to store DNA and protect it. It is also the site of DNA replication, or the making of more DNA. When our cells are getting ready to divide to make two new cells, that DNA has to be copied. It is also the site where RNA is made, and you'll learn more about that later. So here's a close-up picture of the nucleus. So inside is the chromatin that you learned about before. The nucleus is surrounded by a nuclear envelope, so that's just a membrane called the nuclear envelope. Within it are little pores called nuclear pores that allow molecules to enter or exit. And there's also a darker region called the nucleolus. That's not a structure, just a region. And that's where a specialized type of RNA called ribosomal RNA is made. So now moving on to the next organelle is the endoplasmic reticulum. Kind of looks like a system of ribbons that you can see here just outside of the nucleus. And you can see two other images of what the endoplasmic reticulum looks like. There's two types of what we call for short just the ER. So the rough ER is this one that has these little circles on it. The circles are actually ribosomes. So the rough ER looks rough under a microscope because it has ribosomes attached to its surface. And since ribosomes have the job of making proteins, as you already learned about, the rough ER is the site of protein synthesis. And then the smooth ER is smooth, does not have ribosomes on it. It is the site of lipid synthesis. Plus it has some additional functions that we're not going to go into right now. Next is the Golgi apparatus, sometimes also called the Golgi body. It is pictured here in orange. Kind of has this set of, almost looks like a bunch of flattened balloons. You can also see a more realistic picture of what it looks like under a very powerful microscope. So these very flat structures that are a little curved over here are the Golgi. So the function of the Golgi is that it processes proteins and lipids made by the ER and then sends them to their correct destination. So the proteins and lipids are carried to the Golgi with something called vesicles. So here this one is labeled as a transport vesicle. It's carrying a protein that was made on the rough ER, carries it to the Golgi. Then inside the Golgi, the protein might be modified in some way, such as attaching a little carbohydrate group to the protein. And then another vesicle will take that protein, or in other cases, the lipids, to their correct destination, which could, for example, be delivering that protein to the plasma membrane, or even allowing the protein or to exit the cell. And here I have another picture of vesicles. This one's much more complex, but it shows you that there's vesicles that are transporting molecules throughout the cell. So for example, there's vesicles here from this organelle called mitochondria. There's vesicles going this way, that way. there's a lot of movement constantly inside cells. Next, we have an organelle that doesn't have a particularly interesting structure, but it certainly has an important function, or I should say a set of functions. So the lysosome carries out multiple functions that can all be related back to this. So the lysosome kind of looks like a vesicle, and it contains enzymes called hydrolytic enzymes. Now, do you remember from earlier lessons what hydrolysis reactions are? Let me pause to give you a moment to think about it. Think what hydro means. Hydrolysis reactions. Well, you learned that these are reactions that break bonds with the help of water. So these hydrolysis reactions help the lysosome carry out a variety of functions. For one, the lysosome enzymes break down any damaged organelles, and then the molecules from those organelles can be recycled and used to make new organelles. And in certain specialized cells, the lysosomes help to break down engulfed food, as in food that the cell has engulfed and needs to eat. And that brings us to an organelle called the food vacuole. Not all cells have this. So certain cells, such as some single-celled organisms, that their only way to eat is by engulfing cells that are smaller than themselves. So they will surround some kind of a smaller, usually it'll be a little bigger than this. This picture's not great. They will engulf some kind of smaller cell, and once they've surrounded it, that smaller cell will end up inside this big vesicle that's called a food vacuole. So the job of the food vacuole is that it holds engulfed food, and it's a temporary structure. It then fuses with the lysosome. The lysosome releases those hydrolytic enzymes inside it, and those enzymes will then break apart whatever's inside, digesting it, breaking it apart. So you don't eat that way, but you do actually have some cells in your body that have the ability to do this, and those are specialized cells in your immune systems, these called white blood cells that can actually engulf bacteria that might cause disease and you need to get rid of. And now we come to an organelle called a contractile vacuole. This one's interesting, and this picture is actually an embedded animation. I'm going to hit play. So watch what happens at this blue structure. This is the contractile vacuole. So the contractile vacuole has the job of expelling, like pushing out excess water from the cell so that the cell doesn't burst. This contractile vacuole is only present in some single-celled organisms that live in fresh water, such as this microscope picture is a paramecium. Paramecia live in ponds and lakes, and water is constantly flowing into them. And if they had no way of getting rid of that water, they would swell up and burst. So the contractile vacuole prevents them from bursting. Plant cells have another type of vacuole called a central vacuole. The central vacuole is very big, and it actually takes up majority of the volume of the cell. It has a variety of functions depending on exactly which cell it is inside the plant body. One important job of the central vacuole is that it absorbs water to help cells grow in size. So in the case of plant cell, the way they grow to go from a tiny cell to a bigger cell is that they do allow water to flow into them and then expand them. In some plant cells, the central vacuole also stores important ions that have important biological functions. Some plant cells use the vacuole to store pigments, such as this plant that has this nice purple stem. And you can see a microscope image of the cells. They're storing this purple pigment inside the central vacuole. And there's a variety of other functions that I will not go into. All of the organelles I've discussed so far are part of what is referred to as the endomembrane system. So this part of the word endo, that means internal, so an internal membrane system. So this endomembrane system includes the nuclear envelope, the rough endoplasmic reticulum, so all of the membranes making up the rough ER, the membranes making up the smooth ER, all the variety of vesicles, the Golgi, the lysosome, and even the plasma membrane. Yes, I know that's not inside, that's an outermost structure, but all of these that I underlined make up what's called the endomembrane system. And they frequently interact through vesicles transporting molecules between these various structures. Now, there's some other cell organelles and other cellular structures that I haven't yet mentioned, and I will get to in part 3 of this lesson. But I wanted to end this section with this thought. So while we've been looking at a variety of pictures of the cell organelles, these organelles are actually much more complex than textbook images would lead you to believe. I do recommend this lecture that you can find on YouTube by Dr. Volz, who studies how dynamic cells are. And so, for example, she talks about how the endoplasmic reticulum actually extends throughout the cell and has a variety of interesting interactions with other organelles. All right, I'll see you next time.